You can start.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. At the outset, on behalf of AIFUCTO, welcome you all to this webinar. Now, the topic of this webinar is New Education Policy 2020. Now, you are all aware of the fact that for quite some time, around 3 years or more, the education policies were proposed and has been changed. Now, this time in a most unprecedented manner, not discussing in the parliament, taking approval of the cabinet, this new education policy has been passed, and it is being proposed that the new education policy will be implemented right from this month of September. And you just see the condition or when it is being introduced. For the last 5 months or so, the almost the entire academic activities in the country has come to a standstill. In this situation, they're proposing new education policy. I'm not going to talk anything about new education policy in detail because we have our speakers, we have our general secretary who will definitely throw some lights. Only thing I want to make that this 66 pages document have so many new things or so many old things in a new manner. We are quite acquainted with the term PPP, and by the term in PPP, we understand private-public partnership. According to this new education policy, this PPP has become private philanthropic partnership. And this private philanthropic partnership is encouraged throughout the new education policy for establishing new educational institution and to expand education for all. What will be the responsibility or sharing of the government has not been mentioned anywhere. Another interesting thing you see, so far as the school education is concerned, they have started it from the age up to 8 years. They are telling that it is foundational step, and this foundational step they have divided. If you go through the ECC part of the new education policy, you will see the foundational part they have divided into two sections. One is from 0 to 3 and the other is from 3 to 8, which will be taken care of by the Anganwadis. That is a separate thing. I'm not going into the detail. These things, how come the zero comes? Those who are proposing these things, probably they believe in obscurantism. That's why, keeping in mind the story of Abhimanyu, they have proposed zero as well. You just think over it. Everything will be multidisciplinary in higher education. Today we have two speakers, very renowned speakers, respectable persons. One is Professor JAWAHAR Nation. He is the Vice Chancellor of JSS Science and Technology University, Mysuru, Karnataka. I do not know, he will definitely throw some light how his institution, premierly being a science and technology university, will change it to multidisciplinary nature. Also, we have Professor RAMANUJAM. He is a professor of theoretical computer science from the Institute of Mathematical Science, Chennai. It is also a standalone institution which deals with science. What will happen to this institution? They have to become multidisciplinary, like Takshashila, Nalanda, etc. So all these things are there. About the new education policy, three things I want to mention. After that, our speaker will definitely speak. In this new education policy, not for a single time, the word secularism has been mentioned, though that is the main flavor of Indian constitution. This word has never been mentioned. They are talking of increasing GR to 50% within 2030. But not even for a single time they have spoken about the gender balance in education, not about any reservation in higher education. So all these things are there. In my opinion, this is a anti-people, anti-common people, as you'd say, education policy, which will exclude common people from higher in education and higher education in particular. With these few words, I stop saying on new education policy. I particularly welcome once again our invited speakers, distinguished Professor L. Jawahar Nation, Vice Chancellor of JSS Science and Technology University, Mysuru, Karnataka, for accepting our invitation and giving consent to speak here. I also welcome Professor R. Ramanujam, Professor of Theoretical Computer Science, the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai, for being here and accepting our invitation. I also express my heartfelt thanks to Professor PRABHAT Patnaik, retired professor, Center for Economic Studies and Planning, School of Social Sciences, JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. I also express my thanks on behalf of the organization, though it is his duty, but still, it is our General Secretary who took the leadership behind the behind this organizing this webinar and all these things. So I also express my thanks to him for giving good leadership. And I don't want to speak further. Now I would request our General Secretary, Professor ARUN Kumar, to give his introductory remarks. And after him, our first speaker will be Professor L. Jawahar Nation, Vice Chancellor, JSS Science and Technology University, Mysuru, Karnataka. Professor ARUN Kumar, please.
Yes. Our respected President of AIFUCTO, Professor KESAB Bhattacharya, our guest speakers, respected Professor PRABHAT PATNAIK, eminent economist and educationist, our Professor L. Jawahar Nishan, Honorable Vice Chancellor, JSS Science and Technology University, Mysuru, Karnataka, and Professor R. Ramanujam, Professor of Theoretical Computer Science. These are our guest speakers. All the office bearers of AIFUCTO, our leaders of affiliates, all the members of AIFUCTO across the country who are joining us today in this webinar. Friends, I have to put the introduction of this webinar. So at the outset of this national webinar, I feel privileged to welcome you all on the behalf of AIFUCTO. I feel very much proud to be with all of you. Friends and comrades, when the entire nation is struggling to save the lives and health of the mankind, and the economic backbone of the country is in serious bad shape, central government considered it as an opportunity to implement and impose its ideological NEP on the entire nation. The collective consciousness of the nation, nor it exhibits. This NEP, National Education Policy, is not the reflection of collective consciousness of the nation, nor it exhibits the democratic views of all the stakeholders, including AIFUCTO. The claim of the government that before finalizing the policy, wide range consultation have been made. It is just a eyewash and pretensions. Only persons and organizations of ideological affinity with them have consulted. Reason best known to the government, they did not have the patience even for the approval of the parliament. Friends, AIFUCTO already termed the NEP as undemocratic, unscientific, and exclusionary in nature. Exclusionary in nature. And AIFUCTO understands clearly that it will have a disastrous impact on the future of the nation. This NEP 2020 does not reflect the collective wisdom of the country. Friends, NEP is in the line with the central government intentions to hand over all key public sectors to the whims and caprice of market forces, as they have done in the case of banks, LIC, railway, airlines, coal, while BSNL, and even in the case of defense industry. This NEP threatens our federal structure to plurality and diversity of the nation. It negates social justice and a stepmotherly attitude towards ST, SC, OBC, minority, and female also. Dear friends, excessive centralization of governance, encouragement to the private sectors, and the expressed manifestation of changing the curriculum to prepare the base for a theocratic state will have a dangerous implications in future. There is undue emphasis on the online system of teaching and examinations will certainly accelerate the existing social disparity. I think in this critical situation, we cannot remain mute a spectator to see the demolition of entire public funded education system, danger to constitutional ethos, and threat to our plurality of cultures and inherent in NEP. NEP, National Education Policy, will privatize the entire system, providing a death knell to AIFUCTO struggle for a democratic, secular, scientific, and inclusive education. It's my clear view that market, corporate, and fundamentalist forces will take advantage of the situation and will demolish the constitutional foundation of our education system. It's clear from the National Education Policy 2020 that online system in the education Hello, hello.
Hello.
I am audible.
Yeah, you are audible, sir. You switch on the camera, sir. There will be a webcam icon. You
Yes, I have already switched on. No problem. One call has come and that disturbed me. Okay.
probably.
Okay, I am going on. Okay.
Okay.
Your
Okay.
video you need to switch on, sir.
Video is enable chat.
So hold on 1 minute, sir.
Okay, okay.
In your screen. Yeah, yes. You are visible, sir. You can continue, sir. Okay. Friends, kindly hold on. Professor will join. He has already joined. He'll continue. Sir, you can continue, sir. You can switch on the camera.
Yes. Switch on the camera.
Yes. Yeah, yes. Yes.
Yes.
Sir, hold on 1 minute, sir. Sir, you can continue, sir. You can switch on the camera. You can.
Yes. 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 Yes.
Just on the left hand side of your mic, there will be a blue color mic icon, sir. Just,
yes,
yeah.
yes.
Now you can
I
continue,
own.
sir. Yeah, please continue, sir.
Okay.
Continue.
Okay.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Yes. Friends, it is clear from the national education policy that online system in education will open the floodgate to the commercialization and deprive vast majority of the students from the benefits of the knowledge revolution of 21st century. The communal overtone of the national education policy will rob the student's mind the scientific temper and make them victim of emotional frenzy. The structurally changes made in national education policy is mere cosmetic and nothing to do with the quality education. The phasing out of the affiliating systems, a provision for multidisciplinary institutions, and designed to change curriculum will have a disastrous impact on the fate of the teachers and our pluralistic culture and diversity of the country. There is no concrete roadmap we find for the mobilization of the resources, and the entire education policy, I think, is meant to consolidate the forces of centralization, communalization, and corporatization of education. Friends, AIFUCTO rejects this NEP and appeals to all the democratic, progressive, patriotic citizens of India to oppose the anti-people national education policy and to develop a mass movement to make it pro-public, democratic, scientific and inclusive education policy through discussions at all levels, inside and outside the parliament also. With these words, I inaugurate this webinar and hope that the outcome of this webinar will certainly be the guiding forces for the entire teaching community of the nation. Thank you, all of you. Friends.
Thank you, Professor Arun Kumar. Thank you very much. Now, may I now request respected Professor L. Jawahar Nation, Vice Chancellor, JSS University of Science and Technology, Mysuru, Karnataka, to deliver his speech. Sir, you please start.
Yes. Brothers and sisters, Honorable President of AIFUCTO, Professor KESAB BHATTACHARYA, and Professor Arun Kumar, General Secretary, AIFUCTO, and members of AIFUCTO, and my guest colleague, Professor PATNAIK, and Professor RAMANUJAM. Good morning. I am honored today to be a part of this event. It is a wonderful event. The whole nation, I think the teaching community especially, is listening now. And especially being part of the panels, great scholars like Professor PATNAIK and Professor RAMANUJAM. I'm very much honored and delighted. And I am very much indebted to AIFUCTO for inviting me to share my views. And just before I just start talking about my viewpoints, I think that Professor Arun Kumar made it very clear in what way this policy has been one-sided and one-dimensional and unilaterally devised and without much consultations and debates. So taking that note, I'd like to a little bit go back that this policy has been, it reiterated several times with several committees. The first committee was headed by Subramaniam and followed by Honorable Kasturi Rangan. And also Kasturi Rangan committee had 2-3 times revisited the draft based on a shallow consultations that had happened in a couple of times in its evolution. And afterwards, finally, the draft was submitted to the parliament, to the cabinet. And the cabinet had just recently endorsed it and already started implementing the features and recommendations of the policy. So that means that the stakeholders are put in dark, and the stakeholders like the students community, the teaching community, and the business community, and society at large, the political classes, all were deprived of from this exercise, participating in this exercise. And by that way, that without much consultation and without much debate, such a topside down change policy is in the offing, and it has been endorsed and approved by the cabinet. So this is the worry. Why is it happening like this? That everyone knows. But at the outset, I would like to say that last year, the draft policy was released, 2019, early 2019. And finally, the final draft has come out now with 66 pages. The draft policy was about 484 pages, and now it is reduced to 66 pages. But I would like to, submit to this August gathering that there is not much difference between these two drafts. The draft was just 484, which was in detail, whereas the final document comprised of about 66 pages is just the abstract of what the draft was, saying. So that means almost 99% of the policy draft, is same as the final document. So that means it is only an abstract version, but it carries the legacy, the complete details from the draft document. So except minor omissions and additions, almost most of them are same. So that we have to take into account. That means the draft policy had attracted a lot of condemnation and a lot of criticism across the country those days. It seems that those condemnations, criticisms, and inputs were not considered by the policymakers in finalizing the document. So this is my first submission. But at the outset, also, I would like to say that this is not at all a policy. The reason is, this policy to me is simply a set of action points at the operational level. At the operational level. So a policy largely is strategic in nature, and it begins from its own unique philosophy that is conducive and relevant to the conditions for which it has been drafted. But does it consider, or did it consider the conditions, the Indian conditions, the social conditions, the social structure, the societal structure, the social disadvantages, and the poverty, employment, unemployment, youth development, political participation, civic participation, and indigenous knowledge, globalization, market forces, are highly interfering into the academic affairs these days. So my question is, are there any relevance in this policy with respect to the conditions that the India and the Indian society faces today? It is not, is the answer. So majority out of 66 pages, except 20 pages, which are sometimes, carrying some practices copied from here and there from overseas and some other universities. About 40 pages are exclusively written on the regulatory frameworks, hierarchical regulatory frameworks from Delhi to the block level. So that means it is not at all a policy. This policy, I would say that it is a policy fit for an individual institution, a university maybe, not for the country, because it predominantly focuses on only the regulatory frameworks with the bureaucracy and regulatory agencies and government interferences and controlling mechanisms. Nothing more than that. So that means we have to be very much careful in taking this as a policy. I don't think that it is a policy. But let me begin with the vision of the document. The vision, just I'm not going to read the vision, just only a couple of passages I would like to quote. The national education policy envisions an education system rooted in Indian ethos that contributes directly to transforming India, that is Bharat. The policy envisages that the curriculum and pedagogy of our institutions must develop among the students a deep sense of respect towards the fundamental duties and constitutional values, bonding with one's country. The vision of policy is to instill among the learners a deep-rooted pride in being Indian, not only in thought, but also in spirit, intellect, and deeds. So in these are all the key ingredients in this vision statement. This is just a paragraph, the vision. That means a lot. It's just only a paragraph, but this is the theme based on which the policy, the 66 pages have been developed. So my question is, can you notice anywhere in this vision that the vision talks about education, the philosophy of education, the functions of education? Nothing. It talks predominantly about the Indian ethos, and that contributes directly to transforming India. And then, a deep sense of respect towards the fundamental duties and constitutional values, bonding with one's country. I regret a lot. The reason is it says something else other than the vision for the education. It reminds me only about how Gentile, the education philosopher under Mussolini of Italy, those days crafted his education policy, which later on became a fascist end. So my question here is, this talks about the bonding with one's country. Bonding with one's country. This is what Gentile said nearly 100 years ago. He said that a citizen, an individual, exists only in association with the nation. He or she exists only in relation to the nation. That means he or she is bound to act per the desires of the rulers of the nation, the ruling class of the nation, the ideology of the rulers of the nation. So this is what I call it as a nationalistic education. I'm not calling this as a national education, but it is nationalistic education, which purports always the ideals of the ruling class or the ruling caste or the rulers of the nation state. So this had happened 100 years ago. Then after a couple of years, the world started realizing how dangerous it was, and it took the turn of the fascist consequences, and how majority of the people there in Italy, and also a similar kind of education policy implemented during the Hitler's time in Germany, all were facing the problems with education. Education was deprived. Education was monopolized. Education was dictated by the national rulers, the nation state. The nation state said that every citizen should be loyal to the nation state. I mean, the ideals purported and propagated by the rulers of the nation. So that is the idea. And I suspect that in India, the days have come now that a similar approach is happening in the name of national education policy. So this is where I'm very much worried. So when people are talking about the Indian spirit, the Indian ethos, and Indian pride, what do we mean by this? The society, we were all segregated into thousands of castes with different creeds and dogmas and kind of our own practices, and upon which the Indian pride has been built for the past 2,000 years. Is it what the policy talks about on Indian pride? And about 2,000 years, majority of the Indian people were deprived of education. 2,000 years. You can see in the epics. You can see in the history. It is evident that majority of the Indians were deprived of quality education. And is it the ethos? Is it the Indian spirit and the pride upon which this policy wants us to revive back and be very much prideful of the Indian, the doctrines and the Indian history? There may be a couple of here and there some visible, changes happening in the past, especially after the independence. But even today, the accessibility to quality education in this country is the toughest thing for a common man in this country. And when this is the situation, how come that they talk about the Indian pride? And this is the big question to us. And what do we mean by education in the first place then? And I don't think that the policymakers had given a thought to it. To me, it is simply an act, a function between the student and the learner and the teacher. And just to facilitate that learning process, there is a curriculum, and that curriculum is to be developed based on the needs and based on the requirements of the society, based on the needs of the individual, to groom the individual in a proper way, 360-degree, as a learned man or a woman. Say, being that, why do we need on earth so much of hierarchical regulatory regimes, right from Delhi through states up to the block level, the district and block level? And this regulation is very much, it shows that how how education is entrapped under the fold of a nation state. And that is what I would like to emphasize here. There are a lot of things that I think all of us have read. There's 66 pages. I'm not just going to read it. Of course, the policy talks about certain good things in the principles. It talks about recognizing, identifying, and fostering a unique capability of the learner. Good. It talks about creativity and critical thinking. It's also good. It talks about elimination of the rote learning and inculcation of conceptual understanding during the learning process. It's also good. And it also talks about the formative assessment as opposed to summative assessment, cumulative assessment. That is also good. But are they reflected in the subsequent pages, in the 66 pages? In subsequent pages, are they reflected properly in the implementation and strategy and mechanisms that were recommended in the policy? It is not. It is not. How is it? So, for instance, beyond, it talks about some structural changes in school education and higher education. The 5+3+3+4 in the school education. And then 3 different categories of the higher education institutions, like research intense university and teaching intense university and degree awarding autonomous colleges. Say this 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 4 and the 3 type of higher education institutions, these classifications, how these classifications are classifications justify, how do they justify the needs of the educational needs of this country? The policy fails to quote anything on it. The policy did not establish in what way this is going to be helpful to propagate quality education in this country. It doesn't have any answer for this. And also it talks about early childhood care education from the age of 3 to 5. Say, what do we mean by that? And do we need this early childhood care education in this country or not? Was it justified in the policy or not? It is not. And wider, all over the world, I can say that majority of the countries who were talking about early childhood care education, like European countries and United States, they did not make it mandatory. Most of them did not make it mandatory. Because during this time only, the child gets, of course, a cognitive, development during this. But that cognitive development will not happen without the close proximity of the parents, mother, and the society. It cannot be, that cognitive development cannot be inculcated in a closed door environment in a classroom with ill-qualified teachers who doesn't know the child psychology. So is it enough or not? Why is it so? And there is not much justification there in the policy. The policy doesn't have any answer for that. And then it talks about vocational education. At least it says that 50% of the students, whether school going students or the students studying in the universities, should have learned at least one vocation. What is that? Why? And they say that there is no hard separation from vocation and the mainstream academic. And say, if I want to go to Chennai from Delhi, I must go to Chennai. Why should I? If I want to study physics, and I want to study physics only, all relevant knowledge, of course, the domains, I will read, if need so. Being a physics student, why should I learn a vocation? That is the first question. Because my travel is from Delhi to Chennai, and I want to go to Chennai. I don't want to alight somewhere in between and get a partial degree, a partial diploma, and get out of my education. Is it what education means then? If you feel that a student fails during the course of his education, and halfway through he will be awarded a partial degree and diploma, that means it is not the student's failure. It is your failure. It is your educational system's failure. It is your educational functions failure. It is your policy failure. Don't put the blame on the students. All born fresh kids in this country are born with fresh mind. We have to write in their mind with a good educational functions and processes, so that that child will grow with all good quality, with knowledge and necessary skills. Why do you come out with a safety measure, a precautionary measure like one vocation, at least that occasion, if he doesn't fulfill or drops out of his studies, he would be better off with his livelihoods with vocation. This is a completely half-baked understanding on education. The destiny is more important than education. The learning outcomes and educational outcomes are more important than anything else. And that is the most desirable thing that must be inculcated in the curriculum, in the educational delivery systems. If that doesn't happen, then we cannot say that this is education. You are coaching simply. It is a rote educational system then. You're not enabling them to be creative and be critical in the thought process during the education, because you are giving a gateway in between, in different milestones, to get out, get lost from the educational process and do something else. This is not the policy. And also on the vocational things, you know, Indian society is descent-based society, as we all understand. Every work and the skills are attached to the caste and the community, the social group that they belong to. Traditionally, it is a descent-based society. How are we going to use this vocational education to enable the students and learners to cross border and learn the other skills necessary for them based on their desire, based on their wish? Is it going to happen that way? How is it going to? The intergenerational, occupational mobility, that will happen only when we inculcate a different set of skills than vocational skills during this, the studies, if you are wishing for vocational education. So that means, is it really worth to pursue in this country? Of course, in Germany, vocational education is done in a better way, and where it is not a descent-based society. Any student there, any community belonging to any community or any social groups can go and take the skills necessary. Is it possible in this country? The descent and vocational skills are some high-level skills, and with luxurious skills, I would say, which is going to be sophisticated in nature, which is going to generate a lot of income to and opportunities to the learners, are going to be the privilege of some specially cultivated communities in this country. Without looking into the social structure, the societal structure, how are we going to implement vocational education is my question. Because if you are really going to be successful in vocational education in this country, what I want in this policy is that it must allow everyone to choose the vocational skills that they want. And that must be intergenerational occupational mobility should be there for them to go with the skills as they desire. And basically, the vocational skills and vocational education will distort the basic core academic process involved. That must be discouraged and eliminated. And then they are talking about equity and inclusivity. What do they mean by equity and inclusivity? The policy makers have, I think, that a depth of knowledge, a depth of understanding in education, such a way that they reduced the equity and inclusivity in education as simply gross enrollment ratio. By just improving 50% gross enrollment ratio in higher education, I don't think that they are going to, achieve equity and inclusivity. Equity and inclusivity is not just simply lies in the, in the gross enrollment ratio. More than that, it is the way by which, the manner in which the subject matters of instruction are cultivated from the human experience and translated into subject matters in the classroom, in the learning process. And it has to be society-driven then, the curriculum should be. But you are driving the education in this country with the three major forces. That is the nation state, which wants to, put its agenda through education. And there is a specially cultivated class in this society, in the society in this country, which always dominates setting the agenda of this country. And newly, there is another addition, neoliberal market forces. So market-driven, education nowadays. And they set the agenda that this is the skill, and this is the employment skills, and this is the knowledge that I want from the learners. And there are about roughly 6,000 engineering colleges in this country are looking forward and working for only few corporate bodies in this country, because these few corporate bodies and industries are setting up their skill requirements and knowledge requirements. Is it education? Is it education? So it is a triangulated force. They collude with each other, the nation state, the neoliberal market force, and the specially cultivated community, the society in this country, all have joined now and come out with a system called new education policy based on their own desires, based on their own requirements, and based on their purpose. There is a purpose there. The nation state has the power to do it. How can we say that? If my requirements, if my social requirements, if my educational economic requirements are collectively taken as a human endeavors and human experience and translated into subject matters, that is going to generate knowledge. The knowledge productivity is going to happen at the highest level, and it is going to fulfill the aspirations of all walks of life in this country. If the unsegregated cultivation of the human experience happens in the subject matters, in deciding the subject matters of instruction or learning, it would happen. And if it doesn't happen, then how are we going to say that this education is going to be helpful to the majority of people of this country? The majority of the people of this country, how are you going to say that it is inclusive education? It is equity, it gives equity to all walks of life. How can you say? You cannot say that. And you also has come up with the 3-language formula. And here and there that you wanted to say some little, and you are saying some little schemes for improving the enlisted language in the Constitution, the 22 languages. But throughout the document, you are emphasizing Sanskrit. Why? You also said that the National Research Foundation, the National Research Foundation is going to invest a lot of money in propagating and researching on the Sanskritization of the learning process here in this country. You also said that. What is the need for it? And when I'm capable to learn and understand things in my own language, and why should I need another language then? This is what the nation state, this is how the nation state always functions. The nation state always takes education into its hand. The reason is they want to do 2 things: social learning and habit forming. They want to create citizenry. The citizenry to listen their aspirations, to be loyal to the nation state, the rulers. To make a good citizenry, obedient, a loyal citizenry, the nation state always will take education as a tool to do social learning and habit forming. Social learning is nothing but the doctrine that they want to come out with in the education policy that I read in the vision, the Indian pride, the Indian ethos, and the Indian spirit and deeds and so on. And these are the issues that they want to inculcate. This is called social learning. How can they make enable all people fall in line? Only through this kind of a social learning process. That is through social learning, that is through education and habit forming. Maybe some initial criticisms and skepticisms will always be there in all countries. And after some time, once we are used to that habit, and this is the Indian pride that we have to follow, and this is the spirit that we have to follow, then after some time we are used to it. We habituate. So that is the habit forming. All nation state join hands with the ruling class of the society and the market forces and inculcate this. It is undemocratic. If there is no democracy, you cannot say education will do its job, intended job. For education to do its intended purpose, to achieve its intended purpose, you must have a democratic society, unequal, equal society. The society is already graded unequal in nature. There are a lot of suppressions and persecutions happening in the past several years, even today. A lot of wider gaps there in achieving the learning outcomes between the especially cultivated classes and the deprived classes in this country. The document, the 66-page document, doesn't say anything about it. This is what I call social injustice. It is not just only that reservation that gives a proportionate share in enrollment. That is only a little part of inclusivity. The real inclusivity is that it must reflect the requirements, the aspirations, and the questions and challenges of all social groups in this country. Only then education will do its intended job. So besides certain major, top side down changes that they have imposed, the majority of the documents, I said that almost 40 pages talk about the regulatory regimes. I just want to read, how predominant it is in the document you will see. It is like this school education. If you take the school education, National Curriculum Framework for School Education, national textbook, like Mussolini had national textbook, and Hitler had national textbook. Now, the new education policy wants to have a national textbook. National Assessment Center, it is called PARAC in a local language maybe. And National Testing Agency at the central level, and at the state level, Department of School Education, Directorate of School Education, and State School Standards Authority, SCERT, State Council for Educational Research and Training, and the district and block level authorities to monitor and control the education process, right from Delhi to the block level. The complete regulation is there, tight controlled. It is not, they said that light but tight. It is not light. It is very hard and tight. Right from Delhi to block, they want to regulate the education process at tertiary level. If you take the higher education sector, they have Higher Education Commission of India, and they have National Higher Education Regulatory Council, National Accreditation Council, and Higher Education Grants Council, and General Education Councils. Say, they have a series of voluminous number of regulatory authorities. These regulatory authorities are really, going to dominate the education process. It is not those like the students and teachers. And even educational institutions are undermined this way. The policy as a principle, it says that it wants autonomy to students, to faculty, to the educational institutions. Are there any autonomy for the students and teachers and educational institutions? These educational institutions are just going to be the puppet of the people at the center. Simply have to listen what the center wants to do and say. It is like do what I say approach. I don't think that there is any sense of a philosophy, process, and function of education laid out in this policy. I think it is a complete fallacy, I would say. The regulation is much emphasized, and the focus is to make the citizenry only. The focus is to make the citizenry to be loyal to and obedient to the nation state and the stakeholders of the nation states. I mean the ruling class of the society and the neoliberal market forces. And we all know that how the neoliberal market forces have led already this country into a very disastrous situation in the education sector. It's highly commercialized. Private sectors are booming. And it is just only a money-making business in this country. You cannot, there is no comparison. At time now, contemporary times, there is no comparison in the world. You want to make money, you have to just invest in education. And almost 70% of the colleges are privatized, are private colleges. The higher education, almost 30% only is in the hands of the public, but 70% in the hands of the private. And the agenda of education and the subject matters of instruction and the curriculum all are going to be dominated by the neoliberal forces and the private entrepreneurs who are doing business in the form of education. There is no flexibility. There is no freedom for anyone who is really going to, involve in the function of education. So that means my question here is, what are we? What is the solution then? What do we mean by education in the first place? What do we mean by education in the first place? I think that the policymakers, I think, have failed to give a thought to it, because I could not see. Maybe they are knowledgeable. I have a great respect for the committee, but I think that they failed to give a thought to it. So we talk about education dealing only with knowledge and skills, isn't it? So if it is knowledge, then how that knowledge is identified, catered, or learned, and reflected in the educational process. Normally, knowledge springs from the human experience, because the human experience is the springboard where people used to think about and reason about, and then reflect on that experience and conclude the knowledge. So that means a process of reasoning is involved in identifying and reflecting on the knowledge being encountered during the learning process. So that means that knowledge is going to be a self-consciousness, simply a self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is what a rational knowledge. So this self-conscious knowledge lies in the structure of the society, because the human endeavors, the human experience are propagated from the society, from the social groups, based on the challenges, the questions, the requirements of the society. They involve in some endeavors, and that is human experience. And that must be translated and converted and consumed in the education process as curriculum, as syllabus, and it must be let open to the learner, relevant to the subjects that he or she chooses, learns. So by that way, we can create the situation for the students to be self-conscious on the knowledge being received or learned in the classroom or during the learning process. My question is, does this...
Sir, please conclude.
Yes.
Sir.
So please, thank you. So does this happen? Is it going to happen in the new education policy, is my question. It doesn't happen. So that means the subject matters of instruction. I want equity and inclusivity in deciding the subject matters of instruction, and they are going to talk about the knowledge that I need, and knowledge and skills that I would go after my studies to implement in the society or in my professional applications. So that means that must be the educational process should enable the learners to be collectively, for a collective synthesis of knowledge, and that knowledge drawn from different walks of life and their the human experiences. So that is the kind of education that this country needs. If that happens, and the educative capacity of the society will be on the rise. The educative capacity of the society is very much important, because it learns, a society learns and equips itself by reasoning itself to overcome the problems and impediments that they face and resolve its own problems. That is what called educative capacity of the society. That educative capacity of the society is very, very important, that education should address that to make it really happen in the society, both in the society as well in the educational institutions. What the society failed to do in this country, what democracy failed to do in this country, is what education has to do in this country. If education cannot do its intended job in this country, which is the last option for any common human being in this country to liberate themselves, there is no hope in this world that the Indian community would liberate itself in a prosperous way. So I think that on this note, this national education policy should be outrightly rejected, and there must be a momentum created in this country to reject this national education policy and create a new policy in line with what this country and society deserves for. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jawahar Nation. Professor has spoken in detail, starting from nation state, nationalistic education, etc., accessibility, inclusiveness, and GER, etc. And finally, he has also said that some good ideas have been floated in this new education policy, but no light has been thrown about the implementation of those ideas. And also he has said this is an undemocratic education policy and we should reject it. This will not serve any purpose for the common people. So thank you, Professor Jawahar Nation, for your very valuable speech. May I now request Professor R. Ramanujam, Professor of Theoretical Computer Science, Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai, to deliver his speech. Professor Ramanujam.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Let me start with a salute to Narendra Dabholkar, because we are speaking on August 17th, and August 20th was the day when Narendra Dabholkar was assassinated. And the People's Science Movement this week is commemorated as in memory of Dabholkar as National Scientific Temper Week. So I would like to thank AIFUCTO for this invitation. It's an honor for me to be invited to speak. I've also given my email address here, so that anybody who does not have time for comments or questions, please feel free to write to me. As Professor Jawahar Nation mentioned, when we talk about an education policy, what do we expect from a policy? A policy is a statement of intent of a society. Now, what are the expectations from an education policy? I would expect that you look around, look at the state of the education system. In particular, at a nation state, what we have to do is look at and acknowledge the central failures of the existing education system. Because let's be very clear about it, even as we talk about, even as we critique the new policy, we are not talking here as status quos. We're not, let's start with the acknowledgement of the failures of the existing education system. Not everything is great out here. There are lots of problems with the system. But first we must acknowledge the failures. Then we need to identify the causes of such failure and also the strengths of the system. Because you can only build on your strengths. So you have to identify your strengths. You have to identify the causes of the failure. You have to identify the strengths. And then you have to offer solutions to whatever are, to overcome the failures, build on your strengths, and you have to talk about what are the challenges ahead. We have to address the challenges ahead. We want to be rooted in reality while pointing the way forward optimistically. It's very important to be optimistic for a young nation, a highly populous nation, to point the way forward. Because an education policy dictates education for at least one generation to come, probably two at the minimum. And so we are now talking about what are the challenges faced by that population. If that is so, we must say what are the failures of the system. And if we look at the existing system, what's the most glaring failure of the system? Even as we make slow progress towards universal access to schooling, the quality of schooling reflects deep social inequity. By no means are we anywhere near universalization. And even if we talk about universal access, in terms of quality education, we are talking about exclusion of a large majority of children. And if that is not a major failure, what else can be a failure? There is also another important failure, that the school education system, the education system, completely lies disparate from the hopes and aspirations of the common people. Another terrible failure is that in one generation, we have lost a functioning public education system, even though it was not universal, replacing it by an educational market with only the poor as the clientele for government schools. Now, this demographic change has carried a terrible cost. As the middle class withdraws from government schools, the state has withdrawn from government schools as well. On the other hand, it is the government schools which are the only hope for the poor. So now we have a situation where you go to, in the metros, in urban educated sections, if you go, children are basically Xerox copies of each other from similar demographic background. And the market offers a range of a cafeteria of educational services. Depending on what you can afford, you go and enroll. Higher education is singularly characterized by exclusion. Even if you take only enrollment ratios, yes, sorry. Even if you take enrollment ratios, what you have is something like, only 25% of the population, the eligible population, is enrolled in higher education. In a reversal, the elite have access to state-funded education, higher education, and the poor are left to the mercy of market forces when it comes to higher education. Now, and there is something that must be said. Corruption runs rampant in our higher education system, with the universities having very little analytical research culture, and academia remains dissociated from industry and governance. I'll have something more to say later, but this point that academia has no role to play in governance of society is a very important failure of the existing system. And the dissociation between academia and industry is another very sad factor. Now, I would expect that an education policy starts from acknowledging these problems, understanding these problems, identifying the root causes, and addressing these problems. Unfortunately, the NEP 2020 seems to be completely unconstrained by reality. It does not offer any understanding of these issues and their root causes. For instance, it talks about the learning crisis, by which they mean that there is a problem of in-school illiteracy, right? I mean, there is a problem of children who go to school, do not drop out of school, but have a problem attaining literacy and numeracy. Now, this can be called a learning crisis, and it is indeed talked about as a learning crisis. But what are the causes? Does the policy say anything about identification of the causes at all? In fact, it doesn't say. It's completely silent on the root causes. Maybe we can read between the lines and look at the solutions they offer and find out what they consider to be the causes of this central failure. Well, if you look at the solutions that they suggest, that means it's clear that they are having a managerial approach, an administrative approach to the entire problem. Are small schools the reason for the learning crisis? Lack of tutors, is that the problem why there is a learning crisis? Can a school complex, where you have a complex of schools ranging from early childhood schools, nursery schools to higher secondary schools, would that solve the problem? Well, when you talk about the learning crisis, when you say that there is in-school illiteracy, you're not asking the question, who are the children who are going to school and have a problem of literacy and numeracy? You're not asking, which are these children? Are they the children of educated middle-class sections, some children of salaried work employees? Or are they the children of daily wage learners, rural, agricultural labor, Dalit communities? If we are not talking about who are the children who are do not have access to quality education, who are not achieving as discussed in the policy, how can we solve the problem? I think this is one of the central difficulties with this. It does not have an acknowledgement of reality at all. In fact, social justice is not part of the frame at all. It is simply not part of the way the discourse is developed. And I do not see how the central the failures that we were talking about, which are intimately tied to social injustice, social inequality, can be solved by an administrative managerial approach. Now, Professor Jawahar NESAN talked about this, and everywhere we hear the problem of 3 C's in the policy. And typically the 3 C's are talked about as centralization, commercialization, and communalization. Of course, I see what that is about, but I don't know why the video is gone. I do see that corporatization is the problem. I mean, communalization is a problem. Centralization is an acute problem. Professor Jawahar NESAN was talking about it at all. Also, how we started with education in the state list. In the 1972, with a constitutional amendment, it was moved to the concurrent list, and now it has gone to, once again, it's almost all the developments that you see are pretty much robbing the states of their rights. Yes, but what about the problem of commercialization? Well, it actually, what you see is much worse. What I would call it corporatization. It's a corporate approach to the entire education sector. The right to education is recent in India, and it is not easily won. It is not to be taken for granted. Now, what does the policy have what is the impact of the new policy on the right to education? Now, there is talk of early childhood care. Actually, it's only early childhood education. What was earlier talked about is early childhood care and education. By care, typically nutrition is focused on, the physical development of the child is focused on, but now that is moved to early childhood education. Well, even talk of that holds out a promise, but only to deny the substance. The foundation stage that they talk about is offered only by way of curriculum. The multiple pathways that the NEP talks about, the structure of Anganwadis and nursery schools is left untouched. The entirely market-driven nursery school situation in the in urban India, and quite a bit of rural India also, is completely left untouched. And the no detention policy has been scrapped. And that was recently, even before the education policy was introduced. We hear exams by appropriate authority after classes 3, 5, and 8. Now, once you have removed the no detention policy and you have brought in exams of any kind at all, the Kasturirangan committee talked about census exams. NEP is silent on that, but it only says exams conducted by the appropriate authority. Now, whatever be the kind of exams, bringing in exams after classes 3, 5, and 8 goes entirely against the right to education policy, the Act. Another way RTE is diluted and in fact denied is a slogan that repeats everywhere in the NEP, that the private is to be on par with public, that the treatment of private institutions and public institutions will be on par. Now, I don't understand on what basis is this on par status accorded. What is the evidence for this? What is the philosophical basis for this? There's nothing that's given at all. How can, when you treat public and private on par, how can right to education be ensured? We must ask, who are the people that need education to be a right? When we speak of free education, the meaning of free is not any provision for charity. Free doesn't mean without fees. Free means unconstrained. That's the meaning of the word freedom. We cannot cheapen it by talking about it as charity. when we speak of compulsory education, who's the compulsion on? It is not a compulsion on the parent to put the child in school. It is a compulsion on the state to provide, to ensure that all constraints to education are removed. Freedom means without constraints, and the compulsion is on the state. Without this understanding of right to education, if you only talk about equality of educational access and uniform curriculum, it is well known that these are insufficient to assure quality education. How can right to quality education be ensured if now with a highly differentiated society, how can you have equality of educational access? You know, in a family where book reading is normal, newspaper reading is normal, access to educational resources is normal, how can that family be equated with first generation daily wage agricultural laborers family? How can uniform curriculum be sufficient to give equality of educational opportunity to both? That's why the National Curriculum Framework 2005 speaks of equality of outcomes. Right to education has to be understood as ensuring equality of educational outcomes across the population, independent of background. Now, at this stage, I want to mention that my main role here is from my background with the National Curriculum Framework. I was part of the Yashpal committee that formulated the National Curriculum Framework 2005, and in fact, I chaired the National Focus Group on Teaching of Mathematics. So much of my presentation here today would also be from that perspective as having been part of the NC of 2005. There are, I think, with Dr. Jawahar NESAN, I would also like to add that there are many positives in the way NEP 2020 is formulated. So it's not that there is nothing. In fact, if you have a superficial reading of the 66-page document, you would be forgiven for immediately thinking, what is there to oppose in this? Because, it comes with very lofty ideals. In fact, almost all the superlatives in the English language have been taken and sprinkled, liberally on every page. The problem is that every positive in the policy comes with very questionable negatives. For instance, addition of breakfast to midday meals is welcome, but the closure of small schools would reduce the number of children in the scheme. In fact, if you look at states like Tamilnadu, Kerala, and even states like Himachal, right, which have performed very well in terms of access to school, right, it is by ensuring primary schools in the neighborhood that they have managed to reach anywhere towards these targets. Now, how are we going to ensure, by shutting down small schools and the mantra that has been proposed, repeatedly in the new policy, that is of large schools, which are school complexes, how are we going to ensure access for this children who need midday meals and this energizing breakfast, right? So you have to put these two together to see how the positive is overwhelmed by the negative. One of the important things that it offers, which is very welcome at first sight, is offering course combinations at secondary stage. But then you start reading, and they are talking about all kinds of courses at secondary stage. I mean, nanotechnology and biotechnology have no business as being offered as course combinations in secondary stage. And then when you again look at the profile of the learner that I was talking about, somebody who's, let's say, a Dalit girl who's a first generation learner coming from a family of agricultural laborers, not agricultural owners, but laborers. What choices would this girl have at the age of 13? How would she exercise that choice? How would she say, I'm going to want a combination of mathematics and music, which is the sort of combinations that this policy takes tremendous pride in? Notice that to exercise that choice, the kind of autonomy that you need, the kind of capabilities that you need, and this is something that the policy doesn't address at all. In fact, what would result is schools deciding the choices, reflecting social inequality all over again, combined with the demographic pattern that I was talking about, where I said, look at the urban upper class school and the government school in a village, you will see the stark difference in exercise of choices and combinations. And then there are choices given for exams as well. No, I don't understand the choices. I mean, you can take your physics exam this semester, mathematics exam next semester, but then what will happen? Does it mean that will I have a school exam for mathematics this semester at all, or no exams at all? And it's good that flexibility, like you can take it 2 times, 3 times, but it's a logistical nightmare. Again, ignoring reality amounts to here saying that the schools will decide pretty much what they want. And this is what we have seen in our society repeatedly. Dr. Jawahar NESAN has spoken at length on vocational education. I do not want to repeat it, but I do want to say that an emphasis on vocational education is welcome. But what is offered here is training and not education. And leaving the structure, if you do not change the structure, if you say that I will just make opportunity for vocational education, it will just lead to deepening inequality. How many children of IAS officers do we envisage who will be counseled towards vocational education and become plumbers, right? This is something that is not happening, right? And we are only talking about further deepening the social inequality that we have in our society. Interleaving humanities and sciences is welcome, but the project of humanities that you see here is based on an imagined past, a majoritarian, unitarian vision. That is repeated all over the place. Again, Professor Jawahar NESAN has given instances of how it is pushed in this policy. Now, there is plenty to quote, but I'm going to give only one quote from this new education policy. Can anybody make sense of the following wish list? Or how do you take it seriously as a statement of intent? It says, in addition to proficiency in languages, these skills include, now look at the first part, this is about proficiency in languages. The next one says scientific temper and evidence-based thinking, creativity and innovativeness, collaborative approach, citizenship skills, imbibing of constitutional values. Already, you have seen everything jumbled together, and it gets worse. Sense of aesthetics and art, oral and written communication, physical education, wellness and sports. What has it got to do with proficiency in languages and skills? Problem solving and logical reasoning, vocational exposure and skills, digital literacy, coding and computational thinking. Look at that. Coding and computational thinking, ethical and moral reasoning, knowledge of India, including Indian knowledge systems, current affairs, and knowledge of critical issues facing local communities, states, the country, and the world. What is left in this? Can anyone make any sense of a list like this? Now, of course, each of the things in this list is extremely valuable. It's very lofty thinking. But when somebody gives me a basket like this, I can only say that they have got, no idea of what education is about at all, right? How are we to ensure any of these through curriculum and pedagogy? Now, aspirations ignoring reality can only be dreams. We do need dreams, but in a policy, we have to be a lot more definite. For instance, no more memory-based exams. It's lovely to hear that as an educationist of any kind, right? But can we conduct one single open book exam across the country at all stages today, right? I mean, we are very far from even distinguishing assessment and evaluation in our system, right? The classroom assessment is conducted exactly like a board exam. What are we talking about? I mean, I'm a mathematician, right? I'm interested in, my main thing is mathematical sciences. I love the fact that mathematical thinking is emphasized. But the very next sentence says that because India needs people in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Is that what mathematical thinking is about? When it comes to science, it talks about experiential learning and fun projects. Now, make no mistake, this has nothing to do with the spirit of science, right? Let me get back to the Dalit girl that I mentioned, who is works in a village context. She has grown up. She knows a lot about nature. She can make things grow, but she doesn't know, nitrogen fixation. Experiential learning is not the same as experimentation. fun projects is not the same as scientific discovery, right? And there is a lot of difference that we need to understand. There's a lot of, I would say technomania. There's a lot of technology that is mentioned, but technology is not equal to ICT, right? It is not information and communication technology, use of videos, use of internet that is important. Technology means understanding material, working with wood and metal and soil, right? So there is a, gross misunderstanding of fundamental principles of curriculum. There's a lot of talk about 21st century skills. What are they? But I would say again, there is a jumble out there. But 21st century challenges are never talked about at all. How are we going to prepare our students, children for the kind of future that we need to talk about? We are talking in the times of pandemic, right? This is a 21st century challenge, right? What about climate change? What about water? There are plenty of problems, but this is not a curriculum that thinks in these terms at all. It thinks of 21st century skills as internet, as use of mobiles, and it misses completely both the reality and the challenges ahead. When it comes to curriculum and pedagogy, the constructivist paradigm of NCF 2005 is referred to, but if there is a different emphasis here, it's completely lost in the jumble. It's not clear what is the paradigm of curriculum here at all. In fact, the curricular structure of 5+3+3+4 raises many questions in the first 5 and the last 4. In fact, I think it's very difficult to form any coherent understanding of the curricular structure in either of these. The undue emphasis on Sanskrit as a classical language. I hope there will be more talked about this. The entire understanding of classical languages and the singing paeans to India's glorious tradition in education and Sanskrit is something that's completely bizarre. Of course, we know the agenda of that, where it comes from. And the elephant in the room is social sciences. After singing, all this praise of humanities and the need to not compartmentalize between science and humanities, the notion of humanities, the notion of literature, the notion of art is all rooted in an imagined past. But it's, still important for the designers of the policy. But the elephant in the room is social sciences. There is complete silence on the social sciences. And when you talk about critical thinking, without talking about an attitude to, approach to constitutional values, without a commitment to democracy, about critical view of society, it's very clear that this is not what we mean by critical thinking. Teachers are viewed from a corporate lens entirely as employees whose deployability should be ensured at the time of hiring and productivity enhanced during employment. And I see even jargon from management creeping in, like viability, etc. I don't even know where they come in, when we talk in an educational discourse. The notion of academic freedom is entirely alien to this discourse that we see. The Kothari Commission talked of academic community and wanted teachers to write about various national and international issues. Now, this is about as far from the view of teachers as you can have in this policy. And especially in higher education, it's even more drastic. There is a welcome emphasis on teacher education. But again, the ills are not analyzed at all, but a 4-year B.Ed is touted as the magic cure. I don't understand how a 4-year undergraduate system is going to. In fact, even if we take universalization of school education seriously, the current incapacity of the university system to produce trained teachers of the kind that you need is something that the policy doesn't talk about at all. And if an education policy doesn't talk about it, who's going to talk about it? There is a one-size-fits-all, which is terrible. The country's richness lies in its diversity. Now, on the other hand, what this offers is a unitary structure for higher educational institutions, large, multidisciplinary. That's all. The chairman of today's session spoke about how my institute, the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, it's a very good research institute. Now, how is that going to survive in this? What about even large institutions like JIPMER, right? One of the sterling medical education institutions of the country in Pondicherry. Now, why is it good for it to lose its specialized medical stature and become a multidisciplinary university? What will happen to CSIR labs? Well, on one hand, it says no more specialty institutions, but advocates a National Institute of Sanskrit. I don't know how serious this policy is in any of its statements. The National Testing Agency is modeled on American SATs. Now, in fact, it ignores, even if you take the United States, even US academia, there is tremendous critique on how SATs work against the poor in America. Right now, so basically, it's not just a Control C, Control V type of policy where you pick various practices from various places. You're not even looking at the kind of critiques that exist in those societies for those practices. Now, I'm almost at the end of what I wanted to say. I've been giving various examples, citations of various things in the policy. But one thing is clear. As we read clause after clause, we are left wondering, are we talking of this populous, poor country, deeply riven by social and economic divisions, where unemployment is endemic? Eking out a dignified living is a challenge for many. When I say many, we are talking millions. No, there is a sense of responsibility that policy that comes from India must have, kind of deep commitment the state must have towards these people. We are left wondering, are we talking of this country at all? In fact, I wonder, has the NEP been formulated for a country on Mars? I would like to leave you with that question. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this wonderful opportunity here.
Thank you, Professor Ramanujam, for your wonderful speech. Friends, Professor Ramanujam has highlighted many aspects of this new education policy, starting from how academia is dissociated from industry and administration also. He also pointed out that states are not supporting the public funded education as it is expected to do. Also, he has mentioned about school complex, triple C, teacher education, and finally, the one-size-fits approach that this NEP is actually proposing. So we have become enriched after listening Professor Ramanujam. Now, I again extend my heartfelt thanks to Professor Ramanujam for coming here and spending his valuable time in giving the lecture. So thank you, Professor Ramanujam. Thank you very much. Now, may I request our next speaker, Professor PRABHAT, to deliver his speech. I do not have sufficient words to introduce him. He is a person of such a great stature. He is such a great academician. I do not need really to introduce him. May I now request Professor PRABHAT, sir, please deliver your speech.
Sir, actually, sir is having trouble getting connected, sir.
Okay.
I'll join in actually 1 minute, sir, maximum. I am trying to get connected
Okay,
to him,
please
sir.
do that.
Yeah. Sir, actually, sir is having trouble in getting connected,
Okay.
sir. He can at the maximum talk over phone, and it can be only the audio feed can be put up, sir. Can we try it at least?
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Oh, okay, sir. Sir, you can do that. Start, yours.
So shall I start or shall I wait? You give me a call.
You can start, sir. Sir, is it
Please.
audible, sir?
Yes, he is
Of
audible.
course, of
Audible.
course. Okay.
Yeah,
all right.
you can start, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. It is a real privilege that AIFUCTO has asked me to speak at this webinar. Unfortunately, I couldn't get connected, so there is a problem, but I'll try and kind of, speak like this. There is a saying in Russian that what is cooked in the kitchen is not decided in the kitchen. Likewise, what happens in the sphere of education is something which is not decided by matters related to education alone. In fact, it is decided by much broader tendencies in the economy. What are these tendencies? Let me just begin by making some simple statements about it. You see, the idea of a general uniform syllabus education system is an idea that begins with capitalism, because capitalism sets up a labor market. And of course, once there is a labor market in which people move from one place to another, they even move from one continent to another, then you have to have a certain uniform pattern of education in order to cover this, so that the requirements of capital, no matter where the personnel is located, are looked after. So really, this is something that really began with the beginning of capitalism. The feudalism, for instance, people hardly moved out of their villages or out of their local areas. Therefore, the idea of a general common syllabus education over a widely spread geographical area is something which simply had not arisen. But when capitalism introduces, therefore, this idea of educating large numbers of people with a common syllabus, a homogeneous pattern of education, capitalism does not believe in a universal education. It basically believes in educating people to the extent that its requirements are met. Now, this is obvious because, after all, we know that in the 19th century in Dickensian England, there were children who were really kind of destitute and urchins, and they did not have any education, and capitalism did not think in terms of educating them. The idea of a universal education up to a certain level is an idea that actually begins with socialism in socialist countries, and it begins in post-war capitalist countries under social democratic welfare states, many of which had come up in response to the challenge of socialism. Similarly, in countries like ours, in the post-decolonization period, when these countries up to a certain level is an idea that emerged in our country as part of the ambitions of a new nation, as a part of nation building. So the point I'm trying to make is that the contradiction between the requirements of capital and the requirements of nation building is a contradiction that has always existed. Now, in the beginning, we had, of course, a situation where generally, in keeping with the Constitution, efforts were made to set up a public education system, while free and compulsory primary education never really became a reality. but nonetheless efforts were made through public education system to reach as wide an audience as possible. But of course, with neoliberal capitalism, the requirements of capital have taken precedence over the requirements of nation building. And the requirements of capital now are really unlimited. Capital would like only a limited number of people, those who would fulfill the requirements it has to be educated. It is not interested in universal education. Therefore, intrinsic to the requirements of capital is exclusion. That people must be excluded from the education system so that they are not, in quotes, unnecessarily educated when capital doesn't even require their services. Now, it is for this reason that whenever we have had in recent years any such education policy documents, all of them have focused on excluding people. And that is true of this new economic policy as well. It may not appear so because it has all the attitudes, but fundamentally the new economic policy is actually interested in excluding large numbers of people. Now this shows itself in multiple ways. One, of course, is the fact that reservations, that is affirmative action in the form of reservations for OBCs and SCs, SCSTs and OBCs, affirmative action is hardly mentioned anywhere in this entire document. Now we know that it refers to some category called economically and socially deprived groups, but there is no firm commitment to a system of reservation, as in fact there was. Now we know that in many universities in India, including my own university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, reservations for Dalits and OBCs is increasingly now being whittled down. In other words, they are not sticking to the reservation requirements. And this is a university located in Delhi itself under the direct noses of the central government. And so if this university can do this, then clearly the signals are visible that the government is really not interested in pursuing this question of reservation to the full. So this is one very important form of exclusion, because till now, through reservations, at least a lot of people from socially deprived backgrounds used to come to universities, come to education institutions, but that is no longer really going to be insisted upon. The second form in which exclusion occurs is through the privatization and commoditization of education. Now, I know that this document talks about devoting 6% of GDP to education. It talks about doubling the government's 10% of government expenditure, which is the current figure, to 20% in a certain period of time, all that. But in the absence of any specific measures which have to be suggested about how this is going to be achieved, these are again just platitudes. On the other hand, we know that autonomy basically means that many of the colleges which are going to become autonomous will also become financially autonomous. Additionally, there is going to be once more an emphasis on private education. They talk about philanthropic and so on, but on the other hand, between private and philanthropic, the distinction is not always very clearly visible. So in the name of philanthropy, private education systems will also come up. So you have essentially a move towards a privatization of education. Now, if you have that move, any private education system is going to be much, much more expensive than a publicly provided education system. True, the document talks about giving more scholarships and giving loans, but you see, loans don't really work out, because anybody taking a loan, unless such a person is assured of employment at the end of this period of education, will will not be able to pay back the loan, and therefore, like you have mass Kisan suicide, you would actually have mass student suicide. Or fearing such a fate, many students would not even access loans. So the question of loans as a way of providing education to people from economically and socially deprived backgrounds, and education that otherwise is private and therefore expensive, is a non-starter. Likewise, even in colleges, which are, let us say, public colleges, to the extent that they actually become, financially autonomous, this financial autonomy would basically mean that they would have to have charge fees, and if they charge fees, then education becomes expensive. And again, this whole question of scholarships as a way of overcoming this barrier really doesn't work very well, because of the fact that if students are going to, out of student fees, scholarships also have to be paid, the fees have to be high, and that creates a division among students, with some students taunting and jeering other students, saying that, look, you are studying because at my expense. So this whole social division is something which actually would then permeate all educational institutions, and that is really no way of introducing and encouraging collegiality between people who may be socially disadvantaged and others, people who may be economically disadvantaged and others. Therefore, this whole privatization, commoditization of education and liberalization is something which is essentially a measure to exclude people from deprived background. Now, then exclusion is also occurring in a number of other ways. One very obvious way in which exclusion is occurring is in the name of flexibility. We are told that from now on, you will actually have a 4-year undergraduate program, but people can drop out in the midst of it. There are multiple points of exit. They can drop out at the end of 1 year, they can drop out at the end of 2 years. You see, if it was the case that there were specific 1-year programs or specific 2-year programs, which were independent of the 4-year undergraduate program, then one could understand that yes, the government or the system is catering to people who might actually choose an earlier point of exit. But that is not the case. What is actually happening is that from a 4-year program, you can drop out after 1 year, you can drop out after 2 years. That basically means that your education remains incomplete. That basically means that you attend a few classes and then you drop out. And when you drop out, you are handed over a piece of paper. We can call it a diploma, call it a certificate, that okay, this fellow attended so many courses, this fellow attended a year of college, university. Now that really is meant to provide a whole lot of people who are being excluded from the system, a whole lot of people who are barely going to be educated, but on the other hand would be just handed slips of paper as consolations for the fact that they attended the university. So that is really a subtle way, a camouflaged way of introducing dropouts. So this entire system, in the name of flexibility, in the name of scholarships, in the name of loans, in the name of kind of economically and socially deprived groups apparently being catered to, is really providing ways of excluding large numbers of people from the education system. And this exclusion is particularly pronounced in the emphasis that this document has given to vocational training. You see, vocational training must be something which actually comes on the basis of a certain amount of education which is provided to everybody. Because education is also meant to provide citizens for the Republic of India. These citizens must have the capacity to understand public issues, to discriminate between public issues, to be able to assess significant events and issues at the time. But if that education is not provided and everybody is pushed into a vocational stream, in that case, you are simply imparting some kind of skills, but you're not imparting education. There's a fundamental difference between education and skills. Education is supposed to make you think, is supposed to make you question. Skills are not supposed to make you question. Skills are supposed to be simply acquired to make you capable of appearing in the market as a seller of labor power. Now, the point is that that this business about imparting skill has a very important implication, which again we should look at. You can impart skills to a lot of people. So let us say somebody is a computer mechanic, somebody is something else. Now, when you impart a lot of skills to people, then fundamentally they are barely educated and they crowd the labor market as people carrying some skills or the other. Now, in these kinds of skills, what happens is that that any number of people can be accommodated through a system of job rationing. Suppose it is the case that there are 100 people are required. Now, if 200 people crowd the market, then everybody gets employment for half the time. Therefore, the idea would be to impart skills to a lot of people who are excluded from education, let them crowd the labor market, and when they do so, jobs would get rationed out so that everybody gets a bit of an income. But on the other hand, not enough that should, not really something appropriate, but just a bit of an income. So it becomes a very, very easy way of pretending that the education system is producing people who are really kind of skilled personnel to manage the economy and society. But as a matter of fact, here the education system is fundamentally reneging on its duty of providing education to everybody, and at the same time, through vocational training, is giving some skills to large numbers of people who are otherwise excluded from the education system, who crowd the labor market and get some dregs out of it in the form of employment for a few hours or a few days or whatever. So this has been the thrust of this education policy. But it is not only in this way that we have a privileging of the requirements of capital over the requirements of the nation. What would be the requirements of the nation? The requirements of the nation would mean, firstly, that there has to be a right to employment for everybody. And then you have an education system in which people are trained. Not just skills, but people are actually trained more generally, and then they can go up to any level they wish, but they are sure that at the end of it they would have a right to employment. So provision of universal education followed by a right to employment for everybody is basically should be the education policy required by a country like ours. But what is happening is the opposite, namely exclusion of people from universal education and at the same time no right to employment. So basically they just crowd a labor market and whatever they manage to get, they remain satisfied with that. Now this is what the education policy does, and this is what I mean by looking after the requirements of capital as opposed to the requirements of building a nation. Now this is also clear in another way. You see, suppose we are talking about the requirements of really educating an Indian in order to carry out research for it. I'm talking about social sciences. And let me discuss my own subject, economics. In economics, it is impossible for a person to understand the Indian economy, a person who knows nothing about India's colonial experience. a person who knows nothing about India's economic history. But when we say that, look, we are going to have Harvard setting up an institution here, Cambridge setting up an institution here, Oxford setting up an institution here, foreign universities setting up an institution here, and that is supposed to improve the quality of our education system. What is happening is that they don't teach colonial experience there. A Harvard MA in economics would not have anything about India's colonial experience. If anything, it will whitewash the colonial experience that India had. Similarly, Cambridge or Oxford. Therefore, the idea that there is a common syllabus that Harvard has, Cambridge has, Oxford has, which should also be the syllabus in India in the name of apparently achieving excellence, is really to destroy an understanding of an Indian student about our own past. Therefore, instead of training our students in our own country's experience, what is being talked about in the name of excellence is really an obliteration of this experience as far as they are concerned, which would basically make them, again, barely educated, second-rate researchers who would be picking up research topics which happens to be taken up in Harvard or Cambridge or Oxford, and we simply, they would become, if you like, research assistants of professors working there. So this is no way of promoting research. It's a way of privileging the requirements of capital, which is for a universal syllabus, over the privileges, over the requirements of nation building, which is really to make sure that an Indian student understands, knows what the Indian nation is about, what our anti-colonial struggle is about, what colonialism did to our people, and so on and so forth. So every way, it is actually a capitalist document which is trying to exclude people or putting a gloss over it in different ways. Now, similarly, you find that there is a peculiar interest, the interests of the Hindutva elements and the interests of corporate capital and international capital coincide here. Look at, they say that in order to make Indian students feel proud of India, now the point is that India has had a history of the most enormous caste oppression. It has had horrendous practices like untouchability. No sensitive Indian can actually be proud of these practices. So when you say that we must make an Indian student proud of India's past, take pride in India's past, basically then we would not be teaching these aspects. Then basically we would be prettifying India's past, quietly glossing over horrendous practices like untouchability, and therefore we would actually be producing not persons who would be engaged in changing society for the better, but people who would be conforming to the current system of an unequal, caste unequal, class unequal society. Similarly, when you think in terms of Nishkama Karma, it says that we have to encourage people. Now, Nishkama Karma may be fine when it comes to a person's own personal philosophy. But if it is adopted as a social philosophy, then Nishkama Karma is actually a way of glossing over exploitation. A factory worker who goes on strike in order to obtain higher wages. If the factory worker believes in Nishkama Karma, then the factory worker is being taught not to go on strike. Or the child of the factory worker is being taught not to go on strike. Therefore, the so-called introducing elements that make Indians proud, Indian students take pride in India and so on, are ways of introducing conformism in order to perpetuate an unequal society, socially and economically unequal society. It follows, therefore, that this document, this new education policy that the government has adopted is firstly something which is going to cater to the needs of capital. Secondly, it is for that very reason going to exclude large numbers of people. And thirdly, it is going to, make people conformist. Those who are educated are likely to become, because they have been given sold education as a commodity, are likely to be concerned only with the amount of money they get, and therefore they would be conformist, and they would be conformist employees of multinational capital, of the corporate financial oligarchy. Therefore, they would be conformist executives, they be conformist servitors. On the other hand, those who are excluded would also be conformist, because they would be told that, look, whatever little they have been gone through in universities, colleges, and so on, 1 year or 2 years or something, they would be conformist because they would have been taught Indian history in a pretty fine manner. They would have been taught Nishkama Karma as something to aim at, and therefore they would not be people who would be wanting a change. You see, the purpose of education is to make people change society for the better. To change society for the better, you must be dissatisfied with the way society currently is. In fact, the students must be dissatisfied and angry with the way society is before they actually summon up the will to change this order. And if education does not make them dissatisfied with our state of society, if education makes them reconciled to the state of society, then education is fundamentally playing a role which is anti-national, it's against nation building. Therefore, the whole emphasis in this document and the whole emphasis in education policy now is going to be on producing people who would not be interested in nation building, who would not be interested in looking after the interests of everybody in society, who would not be interested in egalitarianism, but who would be interested in their own careers as basically employees of multinational capital. And this is something which I think is very dangerous, because a third world country that was colonized for 150 years, emerging out of that colonial oppression, requires to build a nation which can only strive towards egalitarianism, strive towards full employment, strive towards the welfare state, and anything that detracts attention from that is actually serving the country badly. This education policy, according to me, is going to serve the country badly. Thank you very much for the attention, and thank you. I'm sorry I could not appear in person, but thank you for your patience. Goodbye.
Thank you, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, Professor Patnaik has explained the new education policy in a very wonderful manner. Many things he has pointed out. He has pointed out that requirement of capital is prevailing over the new education policy, resulting in exclusion of the socially and economically disadvantaged groups. And this has a far-reaching consequence of consequences in building the nation. This new education policy will not produce people interested in nation building. Only self-centered type of people will be produced. Now, this NEP, according to Professor Patnaik, is a capitalist document draft for serving the purpose of the corporates. Now, he has also mentioned this new education policy is totally silent about the reservations and for the Dalits, Adivasis, AC, DJs, that is socially, economically disadvantaged groups. And he has said some of his experience in JNU, what is happening. So he has also said that there is no specific measures suggested in this new education policy to fulfill the commitments that has been made in some places of this new education policy. So we have become enriched after listening to Professor PATNAIK. We again extend our thanks to Professor PATNAIK. Thank you very much, sir. Now I request our Treasurer, Professor D. Kumar, to propose formally the vote of thanks.
Sir, Professor Kumar is yet to join, sir, actually.
He is yet to join.
Yeah, yes. I'll try to contact him over phone, sir. Just a minute.
I am here.
Sir, he is getting connected in, he'll join in 30 seconds, 1 minute maximum. You can get the other speakers are still online, sir, so you can interact with them in the meantime, sir.
Okay. Okay. So, Professor Arun Kumar, are you here? Our GS? Professor Arun Kumar?
No, sir. Jawahar sir and Ramanujam sir, Professor Ramanujam.
Both of them are here, na?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay. So, no, I have listened to both of them. So, actually, both of them delivered a very wonderful lectures. Actually, I have a question that what do they think? In this new education policy, some targets have been set so far as the implementation of the policy. Like by 2030 something will be done, by 2040 something will be done. So actually, why do they think it is 2030 or 40? Do they think it is so easy to transform such a big existing education system according to their desire just within 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that, as I was talking about, if there is no acknowledgement of the problem, ground reality at all.
Yeah, that you have mentioned.
Then you can always set a target, right? I mean, if, so basically, at least my understanding of it is then that there is no seriousness to achieving the target by a certain,
right.
Date. You're just if you're not analyzing the problem and providing a solution, it's very difficult to take the numbers seriously at all. That's what I would say.
Another thing has taken me aback. I have totally surprised that they have made reference to very old and ancient India many a times, pretending as if in modern India, in recent past, or in few years back, or within 100 years, nothing has been achieved in India. You see, they are proposing one new education policy. They are mentioning so many great scholars like Barahomir, Aryabhatta, Panini, Patanjali. Everybody's names are there, but they are not for a single time. They have recognized the contributions made by Professor Amartya Sen or Professor Abhijit Bandyopadhyay. Not even for a single time they have named Rabindranath Tagore. And also, in the space research, India's one of the landmark achievement was sending Agni missile to space. And the leader of that scientific and technocrats group was Professor APJ Abdul Kalam. His name is also not mentioned anywhere. So what do they think? Everything that what India is today is only because of that ancient India. Nothing has happened in between. I don't understand. What type of logic is this?
It's not only about in the sense of ancient India that we're talking about. It's also when you come to literature and art, the humanities are talked about extensively, but they are not talking about people's art, people's literature. You're talking about Sanskrit and you're talking about something that is, as I said, an imagined past. So, Professor Patnaik was talking about attitude to economics, attitude to development. There is also attitude to what Indianness amounts to, and I think this is the major problem. It's a majoritarian, unitarian vision, which does not acknowledge the diversity, the richness that diversity in Indian reality is about. There's a further problem, which is about how we understand, the aspirations of people, right? I mean, what people actually mean, and so I think all practices of the people are not thought about at all. So I think there is also a very dangerous code word. I mean, in earlier documents, people used to talk about national integration, and that is replaced by cultural integration, and that's I consider that quite dangerous, because in a country like this, to talk about cultural integration definitely pushes a communal agenda and goes against the spirit of diversity. So this is something that, of course, we have to be on guard about on every sector, but in education policy that is particularly scary in many ways.
And in the list of the languages, you see in the school education part, they did not mention. They have mentioned the classical Indian languages, Tamil, Telugu. Fine, all right. I have no objection to that. Sanskrit is there both in the case of school language list, and so also in the case when they have dealt with languages in higher education part. But nowhere they mention the languages like Urdu, Bengali, and Chinese. That is one thing. Another thing is this: they are talking about giving huge autonomy, enough autonomy to the faculty members and others, etc. But they have said, so far as the curriculum is concerned, there will be a broad outline within which the academicians have to operate. So what type of autonomy they are talking about? And so far as the administration is concerned, they are proposing BOG consisting of leaders. These leaders will be identified first. Now these leaders will prepare or make next group of leaders, etc., etc. But no representation of the stakeholders have been mentioned. In an institution management, if the stakeholders are not given the opportunity, they are not included, how the excellence of that institution can take place, I don't understand. This is the thing.
Yes. I agree
Sir,
the spirit of your remarks here.
Excuse me, sir. Sir, I contacted Dr. Kumar, sir, but due to some technical issues, again, he couldn't get connected. So he requested either you or General Secretary to give the vote of thanks on his behalf, sir.
So you see whether General Secretary is here. If he is here, he will deliver the vote of thanks. Otherwise, I shall do.
He logged in, but again he's offline, sir. So it's getting extended. So it's
Late.
better that you do the vote of thanks, sir.
Okay.
Thank
So once again, on behalf of AIFUCTO, I extend my heartfelt thanks to our invited speakers, Professor JAWAHAR Nation, Professor R. Ramanujam, and Professor PATNAIK. All of them has given a very wonderful and informative lectures. And listening to them, we have started thinking. Definitely, I believe listeners will started or looking at the new education policy from new angles, angles, and we'll start reading these things between the lines. Now, again, I want to say one thing, that this document, as all of them have pointed out, it is not a pro-people type of document. This document has not been drafted or designed for the benefit of the common people of India, but for the interest of a privileged class of Indian people. That's why those who believe that education should be for all, it should be an inclusive thing. They must raise their voices, arise people, try to organize people, try to build up their opinions against this anti-people education policy. If that is done, then our purpose will be served. And in this connection, I also take the opportunity to request all the affiliates of AIFUCTO to hold such webinars and programs again on this new education policy. With these few words, once again, I extend my heartfelt thanks to all the speakers and also the TNGCTA for providing this technical support and taking pains for organizing all these things. So with these few words, I conclude. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dear participants, the feedback form is on the chat box. You can click the feedback form and can fill up the form so that you will get the certificates within 24 hours. Thank you for all your support, and thank you once again. Sir, we are winding up the session, sir.
Okay, thank you very much.